39 years ago, a one-year-old boy vanished without a trace on an ordinary evening in Nashville, Tennessee, right in the middle of a crowded bowling alley where his parents were enjoying themselves. Police suspected a red-haired man driving a red Pontiac was involved. But with no body, no traces, and very few leads to follow, the investigation eventually stalled. Yet through all those years, a desperate mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her son was still alive somewhere. Then one day, when investigators revisited the old case file, they uncovered a tiny detail that had been overlooked for decades. A detail big enough to shake the entire case and leave the whole country stunned. Before we dive deep into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love real-life crime stories, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Nashville, Tennessee, summer of 1986. The city still had that peaceful southern U.S. vibe before heavy industrialization hit. Two-story wooden houses lined Maplewood streets. Porches flying flags, kids playing ball in the yards, adults gathering at family diners. Life moved slow enough that people believed bad things only happened somewhere else. The Perez family lived in the southern suburbs in a small white house with a low wooden fence and a lawn Daniel mowed every weekend. Daniel, 31, was an electrician for a local company. Quiet, principled. Maria, 27, worked part-time as a nurse at a clinic, gentle, always smiling. And Elijah, their one-year-old son, was the center of every conversation at home. The boy had light hair, deep brown eyes, and a laugh the whole neighborhood knew. They weren't rich, but they were happy. Simple dinners, country music on the radio, and the simple belief that life would stay that way forever. On Friday night, Daniel suggested the family go out after a long work week. They chose Galaxy Lane's bowling center, the liveliest bowling alley in the area, where Daniel's friends usually hung out on weekends. As their car pulled into the parking lot, the sky still held the last light of dusk. The temperature pleasant enough for Maria to carry Elijah out and adjust the little knit cap on his head. Inside, neon blue and red lights reflected off the tiled floor, the smell of popcorn mixing with lane oil. Daniel ran into a few buddies, shook hands, and chatted while Maria carried Elijah over to the kids' arcade corner. The game machines blared cheerful sounds. Elijah slapped the screens and laughed. While Daniel went to get drinks, Maria sat down watching her son play and glancing around. That's when she noticed a tall man with reddish hair leaning against the nearby wall, wearing an old denim jacket. His eyes lingered on Elijah long enough to make her uneasy, but she quickly told herself he was probably just another customer waiting for a lane. A new song came on. The crash of bowling pins drowned out everything else. Elijah toddled toward the change machine. Maria turned to wave back at Daniel, who was signaling from across the room, when she looked again. The child was gone. She jumped up, scanning the arcade area. Nothing. She thought he was hiding behind a game, bent down to look, then ran between the rows of seats. Nothing. She called softly at first, then louder, her voice shaking. Daniel came running when he saw his wife in a panic, and immediately searched the restrooms, hallways, and the emergency exit at the back. Center staff and a few customers spread out, calling the boy's name until it echoed through the whole building. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. No one found anything. Maria started crying, clutching Elijah's little jacket with trembling hands while Daniel looked around in stunned disbelief, as if he couldn't process what was happening. The once noisy space fell silent, except for the hum of the AC and the sound of running shoes. When it became undeniable that Elijah had vanished, Daniel rushed to the front desk, voice hoarse, demanding they call the police. The manager immediately dialed 911 while asking all customers to stay put. Minutes later, the 911 recording captured a panicked man's voice cutting through the chaos of a suddenly silent entertainment center. His one-year-old son had disappeared from Galaxy Lane's bowling center in South Nashville. The dispatcher activated Priority 1 protocol for a missing child and contacted the nearest patrol units. 2 patrol cars left the station within minutes, sirens blaring down quiet streets. When they arrived, the parking lot was still lit by bright neon, with a few tense customers lingering. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Conversations died as the first 2 officers entered. The manager had halted all activity and ordered staff to preserve the scene. The young couple sat by the counter, the mother with her head down, clutching the child's jacket, the father standing by the phone, eyes blank. Lieutenant Harold Moore, night shift commander for the Nashville Police Department's investigative team, was called to the scene after the initial report. He'd handled dozens of lost child cases in Middle Tennessee. But the moment he surveyed the area, he knew something was different. No scattered toys, no crying child, no signs of movement in the arcade. Moore ordered the entire building locked down, security to block the 2 main exits, and check all side doors. One team fanned out across the parking lot. Another swept the interior. The crime scene unit was called in with cameras and evidence bags. Moore opened his notebook and began taking statements. The manager said about 30 people were inside when the boy vanished. A janitor reported seeing a red-haired man in a denim jacket carrying a child out of the arcade toward the rear emergency exit. She assumed it was the father and thought nothing of it. Minutes later, a teenager working the snack counter said he saw a red Pontiac peel out of the lot near that same exit. Around the time everything happened, he remembered the taillights flashing twice before the car sped off toward the southern highway. He couldn't read the plate, but was sure it was an early 80s sedan. Moore wrote down every detail, ordered patrol units to run registries for matching vehicles in the city and surrounding counties, and told Highway Control to flag any red cars caught on camera that night. Back inside, Maria was being tended to by medics, face pale, clutching a blanket, and asking in broken breaths, "Did you find him? Where's Elijah?" Nearby, Daniel tried to stay calm while answering questions about when they'd separated and the last place he'd seen his son. No one could focus, only the constant click of cameras and the chemical smell from the disinfectant the techs sprayed around the arcade. The whole area was cordoned off with yellow tape. Witnesses were asked to write formal statements. Another team examined the security system and removed the VHS tapes for processing at headquarters. Outside, the wind shifted and rain started coming down hard. Moore stood under the overhang, watching patrol cars circle the lot, red lights reflecting off wet pavement. He mentally lined up the details, timeline, the red-haired man, the cars speeding away. Everything pointed south toward the highway, not into the residential area. Though evidence was still thin, he already had a strong feeling this wasn't an accident or a toddler wandering off. When the lobby clock passed midnight, Moore closed his notebook, ordered the search radius expanded 5 miles around the center, and put out an all-units alert for the red Pontiac. The preliminary report was sent to headquarters, officially elevating the case to special investigation status. By dawn, Galaxy lanes remained under strict lockdown. Under police floodlights reflecting off wet pavement, the Nashville PD crime scene unit arrived with cameras and evidence kits. Lieutenant Harold Moore directed a second sweep of the rear emergency exit. The route witnesses said the red-haired man took while carrying the child. The door was slightly ajar, hinges wet with rain, showing it had been pushed open from inside. No pry marks or scratches. The door had been opened normally, meaning the suspect likely used the handle like any customer. The tile nearby showed faint large shoe prints with a ridged sole pointing outward. Under UV light and luminescent powder, the prints became clearer, and next to them was a wet mud streak leading to the curb. About 3 meters from the door, tire tracks cut deep into soft mud, where the car had accelerated hard. Moore ordered measurements of wheelbase and track width. Data matched a mid-size sedan like the Pontiac. He had the mud section and tire soil samples sealed for comparison. Inside, techs checked door handles, game controls, and the change counter. Under black light, several fresh fingerprints appeared, some belonging to staff, others greasy and unknown. All were photographed, labeled, and lifted. In the arcade, the old VHS surveillance system was still running. A technician removed the tape, sealed it, and sent it to the lab. Before it left, Moore insisted on a quick on-site review. The grainy black and white footage jumped, but at the 22-minute mark, a tall figure in a light-colored jacket appeared in the back hallway carrying a small light-colored object. Timing matched Maria's realization that her son was gone. The clip lasted only 4 seconds before static took over, but it clearly showed movement toward the emergency exit, the same direction as the shoe prints and tire tracks. Moore ordered the full tape sent for frame-by-frame enhancement. Other evidence was cataloged: mud from the scene, flecks of bright red paint on a fence post, likely scraped off during a hasty turn, dark fabric fibers caught on the door hinge, possibly from the suspect's sleeve or clothing. Everything was labeled and sent to the lab. A young officer returned with a new witness statement. A regular evening waitress said she'd seen the red-haired man several times over the past month. He always came alone, sat at the back tables, never bowled, just watched people. The last time, he asked her about closing time and the location of emergency exits in case of fire. She thought he was just curious about safety rules. Moore took detailed notes: dark red hair, about 5'11", thin build, Midwestern accent, no rings, small scar on left cheek. She didn't know his name, but remembered he drove a low red car. All information went into the initial case file. Meanwhile, analysts began mapping the scene: disappearance point, movement path, exit door, evidence location. Every line on the sketch led to the rear of the building, where tire tracks disappeared onto the main road. As dawn approached and the rain stopped, Moore ordered final overall photos of the scene for the file. He drafted the preliminary report to Nashville PD headquarters, summarizing the timeline, victim status, evidence collected, witness descriptions, and suspected vehicle. Conclusion: no signs of struggle or accident. Emergency door open from inside. Tire tracks and evidence indicate premeditation. High probability of targeted child abduction by someone familiar with the location. The report and all samples were dispatched at first light, officially opening the investigative file on the disappearance of 1-year-old Elijah Perez from Nashville, Tennessee. As the eastern sky began to pale, the official search expanded beyond the bowling center. An emergency mobilization order followed the preliminary report, marking a 5-mile radius around Galaxy Lanes on the incident map. Lieutenant Harold Moore commanded on-site, dividing forces into 4 teams, one along the Cumberland Riverbank, a second through the small woods behind the shopping center, a third along the road leading to the highway, and a fourth with K-9 units sweeping nearby neighborhoods. Patrol cars blocked access roads, blue and red lights flickering in the mist. Overnight rain left the air heavy and mud clinging to boots. Local volunteers showed up with flashlights, blankets, and water. Some were customers from the night before, still shaken. Moore set up a temporary command post on a truck bed, maps spread out, red markers circling priority zones, starting at the emergency exit and stretching south toward low woods and a creek feeding the river. Rescue teams advanced in lines 10 meters apart, marking cleared areas. Overhead, a police helicopter circled, spotlight sweeping the ground, rotor noise echoing through still sleeping neighborhoods. On the ground, K-9 teams started where the shoe was found, giving dogs Elijah's clothing to scent. At first, the dogs pulled hard toward the woods, but lost the trail after less than 200 meters. Moore had techs measure humidity and wind direction. Overnight rain had likely washed away any scent. He redirected efforts to the riverbank. Dawn light filtered through thick fog as searchers waded through wet grass. Under an old railroad bridge, the river ran high and fast from the rain. A small rescue boat launched, scanning drifting logs and eddies with spotlights. No sign of the car or anything suspicious. In the woods, firefighters cut paths through thick brush. Bits of clothing and trash were checked and discarded. Everything was quiet except radio chatter and wind. Another team went door to door. Most residents had been asleep. One woman recalled a loud engine around 11 p.m., thought it was a truck. No one saw a face or clear direction. Time dragged on, energy faded. Hot coffee was passed around. everyone soaked in sweat and rain. Moore reviewed the checklist. No new traces, no evidence, no witnesses. He walked back to the muddy tire tracks, past a section of collapsed fence from a patrol car, then toward the woods again. The helicopter made one last low pass, light cutting through steam, nothing but wet treetops. At 5 a.m., wind shifted and heavy fog reduced visibility to a few meters, forcing a safety pause. Moore called team leaders to the command post for reports. Nothing new. The entire area was marked with yellow-painted stakes, labeled cleared. He looked at the gray sky as light rain returned, a distant train whistle adding to the heavy fatigue. At 6:30 a.m., he officially suspended the search and ordered units back to headquarters for strategy reassessment. The bowling center remained sealed, yellow tape flapping in the morning breeze. Inside, dim lights still glowed on the cold tile floor, where the night before, a little boy had vanished without leaving a single trace. After the initial search operation ended without results, the Nashville Police Department shifted its focus to verifying the suspicious vehicle described by witnesses on the night of the disappearance. Lieutenant Harold Moore proposed launching a manhunt for all red Pontiacs within a 50-mile radius of the city, viewing it as the only viable lead to uncover clues. The next morning, an urgent bulletin was sent to all police units in Davidson, Williamson, Rutherford, and Sumner counties, requesting a sweep of vehicles of the same make and model, cross-referencing registration records, and checking owners who had received traffic citations or changed ownership in the past 3 months. The Tennessee Department of Motor Vehicles provided a list of more than 120 Pontiacs with similar coloring in the area. The data was categorized by year of manufacture, body style, and registration status. Moore's team divided the list and began contacting each owner, verifying their location on the night of June 12th. Many vehicle owners were confirmed to be at home or had clear alibis. However, 8 vehicles remained unaccounted for because the owners were absent or unresponsive. Moore deployed patrol teams to each address, checking garages, parking lots, and public areas, while also notifying gas stations and motels within the search radius. At rest stops along Interstate I-65, police posted flyers describing the vehicle and featuring the missing child's photo, hoping someone had seen or remembered something. Numerous gas station attendants and long-haul truck drivers were interviewed, but no one provided clear information. 3 days later, a report from the town of Brentwood drew attention. A local gas station employee stated that on the evening of June 12th, they saw an older red Pontiac parked at Pump 3 for about 10 minutes before leaving. The driver was a middle-aged man with light-colored hair, alone, never exiting the vehicle, paying in cash, and saying nothing. The station's security camera captured blurry footage. Neon light reflections made the license plate unreadable. The tape was sent to headquarters, but even after multiple enlargements, it remained too unclear to identify details. Moore compared the body shape and ground clearance in the images, concluding it matched an early 1980s Pontiac Grand Am. He immediately ordered a search for matching vehicles in the Brentwood area that night, but the list was still too large for manual checking. The investigative team used toll booth records to identify red vehicles passing through the area between 10 p.m. and midnight. But the system was not yet automated, and much of the data was missing. Officers visited each booth to review handwritten logs, most of which contained only partial plates or notes like red passenger car. Moore admitted there was insufficient evidence to link any specific vehicle to the scene. Meanwhile, forensic technical analysis of the paint chip recovered from the rear door of Galaxy Lanes revealed a red acrylic-based compound common to many American cars manufactured during that era. The lab report concluded that the sample alone could not pinpoint the exact make. The mud sample contained alluvial soil typical of the Cumberland region, offering no specific location. Tire tread analysis showed a common commercial pattern with no distinctive features. These findings pushed the investigation into a technical dead end. Nevertheless, Moore continued the sweep. Over the next 2 weeks, he and his subordinates visited every junkyard, repair shop, and used car dealership on the outskirts of Nashville, inquiring about recent red paint jobs or door replacements around the time of the disappearance. One shop owner in Franklin recalled a man with reddish hair asking to buy matching paint but did not record his name and made no sale. The lead quickly went nowhere. Moore compiled a comprehensive file of all verification results. 127 red Pontiacs checked, 96 with confirmed alibis, 23 not matching year or paint, and 8 with temporarily unverified owners. He recommended closing the open list and transferring the data to central records. The report concluded, insufficient data to identify the perpetrator or related vehicle. In the final evaluation section, Moore noted that the high likelihood of fake plates or an out-of-state sale meant federal coordination would be needed if concrete new evidence emerged. He signed, stamped, and sent copies to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, filing the records under code Elijah Perez. Vehicle lead 12. Outside, the sun had returned, but the parking lot in front of Galaxy Lanes remained cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the hot wind. Passing cars now saw only a wooden sign scrawled in chalk, closed for investigation. News of Elijah Perez's disappearance spread rapidly across Tennessee, from local bulletins to national television networks. Within 3 days, morning newspapers unanimously ran the child's photo with bold headlines. 1-year-old boy vanishes from Nashville bowling alley, suspected abduction. Elijah's face, brown eyes, and bright smile appeared on every public bulletin board, church, and gas station. Police opened a tip hotline, but instead of leads, they received hundreds of panic calls from the public, including baseless rumors. Public opinion split into 2 camps, one believing in abduction, the other suspecting the parents' involvement. Reporters camped outside the Perez family home, waiting for the slightest movement. 24-hour news channels broadcast images of Maria stepping onto the porch, her face gaunt, while Daniel avoided cameras. Public pressure elevated the case to the Nashville Police Department's highest priority. Lieutenant Harold Moore was forced to hold a press conference, stating that the investigation remained open and no specific suspect had been identified. Those words only fueled media speculation that police suspected the family. 2 days later, superiors ordered Moore to formally interview Daniel and Maria to rule out internal involvement. The interviews took place in an interrogation room at Nashville Police Headquarters, supervised by the district attorney. The room contained only 2 chairs, a recording table, and a 2-way mirror. Maria was brought in first. She recounted the entire evening in minute detail: departure time from home, the drive to the bowling alley, when Daniel left the table, and the moment Elijah vanished. When asked about the exact time between losing sight of her son and alerting staff, Maria estimated 10 minutes, though her earlier statement said less than 5 minutes. Moore noted the discrepancy and pressed her. She hesitantly said she couldn't remember clearly due to panic. When Daniel entered, he insisted his wife noticed the child missing only minutes after he left, and the search inside the building lasted about 15 minutes before calling police. The 2 statements differed by nearly 10 minutes, a small gap, but enough to catch the prosecutor's attention. Moore continued questioning about their marriage, jobs, and finances. All answers were reasonable, with no significant conflicts uncovered. Afterward, the couple was asked to take polygraph tests to assist the investigation. Both agreed. The tests were administered by an independent examiner at the state police office. Maria, after instructions, appeared tense from the first question. Readings fluctuated heavily, resulting in an inconclusive outcome. Daniel remained steadier, but 2 questions about the last time he saw his son showed irregular heart rate spikes. The report noted, "Cannot conclude deception, recommend not using these results as evidence." However, once leaked, the media exploited it fully. Headlines screamed, "Missing boy's mother's lie detector results spark controversy." Evening talk shows invited psychologists, some saying Maria's reactions could simply be psychological trauma, others claiming a normal mother would never forget the timeline of her child's disappearance. Public division deepened. Moore received dozens of anonymous calls, some accusatory, some defensive. Meanwhile, the Perez family was under constant watch. Maria quit her job and rarely left home. Daniel taped paper over the windows. Moore requested temporary police protection around the house to prevent clashes with reporters. But pressure came not only from outside, but also from above. The department needed answers. After 2 weeks reviewing all records, Moore submitted a comprehensive report. No physical evidence or credible testimony links the parents to the disappearance. Timeline inconsistencies in statements are likely due to psychological state. He recommended temporarily removing them from the primary suspect list while keeping files open. The district attorney agreed, stressing insufficient grounds to charge anyone. The next press conference filled the briefing room. Moore, visibly exhausted, repeated that the investigation continued and all possibilities were being explored. When pressed on whether police failed to secure the scene, he replied curtly, "We are still working." Outside, people gathered holding Elijah's photo, praying. Media heat turned the case national, but the more it was discussed, the clearer the information void became. When camera crews finally left the old bowling alley for newer stories, Moore looked again at the files on his desk, statements, polygraph results, timeline comparisons, all pointing to the same thing. They had no evidence to charge anyone, nor to clear anyone. Elijah Perez remained listed as missing under unknown circumstances, and after nearly a month, the case stood exactly where it began. 3 weeks after Elijah Perez's disappearance plunged Nashville into crisis, an unexpected report arrived at the department from neighboring Arkansas. A highway patrol station outside Little Rock reported discovering an abandoned red Pontiac in a vacant lot near Highway 67, more than 300 miles from Nashville. The license plates had been removed, doors were locked but undamaged, and the windshield was covered in a thin layer of dust and dry leaves, indicating it had been there for at least several days. The information was immediately forwarded to Lieutenant Harold Moore's office, the lead investigator on the case. He departed that night with 2 forensic technicians. Upon arrival, the vehicle was already temporarily cordoned off, surrounded by police tire tracks and boot prints in the dry dirt. Moore ordered it left untouched until initial inspection. The Pontiac matched the body style witnesses described, its once deep red paint dulled by dust, the rear caked with dried mud. When technicians shone flashlights into the front cabin, they detected lingering odors of gasoline and fermented yogurt. The floor held dried milk spills and white residue. The back seat was covered by a gray wool blanket. Beneath it were several short light-colored hairs curled and stuck to the upholstery crevices. A small receipt was found in the glove compartment, a gas purchase dated June 12 from the Brentwood, Tennessee station. The exact night Elijah vanished. Moore ordered all evidence sealed, carefully bagged separately in nylon, and sequentially numbered. The trunk contained only an empty plastic gas can and basic tools, nothing noteworthy. Engine oil was still faintly warm, suggesting recent travel. Closer examination of doors and dashboard revealed a smudged fingerprint on the rear window and a small fabric fiber caught in the door seam, both collected and sealed. Moore inspected the exterior. The right front tire had a slight tear, as if it struck something hard. He measured tread spacing and found significant similarity to the tire marks at the bowling alley's emergency exit. Though not conclusive, the match convinced him this could be the vehicle that fled the scene that night. As the car was towed to the Arkansas State Police Forensic Garage for detailed processing, Moore contacted the Tennessee State Lab requesting assistance, especially with the hair samples. However, in 1986, DNA testing was still in its infancy. Civilian labs lacked equipment for high-accuracy genetic comparison. The hairs were logged, stored in glass vials, and refrigerated, awaiting future technology. A technician suggested blood type or protein analysis, but the samples were too small for traditional testing. The dried milk on the floor tested positive as infant formula, but no usable fingerprints were recovered. The gas receipt's signature line was faded. Only the station name and payment time, 10:49 p.m., remained clear, aligning with Maria's report of the disappearance. Moore requested full photocopying, assigning code P8647. While the Arkansas team finished evidence collection, he drafted a report to Nashville PD detailing time, location, evidence, and possible case connection. It was signed, stamped, and a copy sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for interstate coordination. The next day, the Pontiac was transported to TBI's Nashville evidence vault for long-term storage. When sealing was complete, Moore stood watching the car under fluorescent lights, its faded red paint eerily still. He knew he might have found the case's most critical evidence, yet also understood they lacked the tools to prove it. The final report sent out stated clearly, current DNA testing technology insufficient to link vehicle samples to the missing child. Recommend long-term preservation for future investigation. The file was closed in a brown cardboard folder labeled Case Hash 1986 Perez, Vehicle Evidence. Simultaneously, Moore updated the full investigative log, adding 13 new evidence entries including hairs, paint chips, receipt, and suspected milk residue. Everything was archived per protocol and transferred to TBI with dual state signatures. By day's end, as he left the warehouse, rain poured in Arkansas, droplets splashing on wet pavement and reflecting the red of the tow truck. One thought kept circling in his mind: how far had that car traveled that night, and who was behind the wheel? In 1986, at least, that question had no answer. After the red Pontiac was sealed and transferred to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's evidence vault, the Nashville Police Department's active investigation entered a period of stagnation. 2 months passed with no new leads. Hotline calls dwindled. Mostly rumors or mistaken sightings. Lieutenant Harold Moore, the case's primary officer, completed a final comprehensive report for the department listing all evidence, statements, and unresolved questions. In the 17-page summary, he acknowledged no further field data existed to pursue. Every avenue had been exhausted. By September 1986, the Davidson County District Attorney's Office announced suspension of active investigation, reclassifying the case for passive monitoring. The Perez Case Hash 1986 file was handed to TBI, the state agency responsible for storing and periodically reviewing unsolved missing person cases. Upon receipt, it was categorized as unresolved child abduction case, grouped with similar unsolved child kidnappings over the previous decade. Physical evidence, the Pontiac, hair samples, paint chip, gas receipt, was sealed in TBI's main Nashville warehouse with detailed inventory lists. Each item received its own identifier, noting date, transferring officer, and recommended storage temperature. Moore signed the transfer form, officially closing Nashville PD's initial responsibility. He maintained contact with TBI, occasionally forwarding tips from neighboring states, but replies were consistently, "No new developments." Meanwhile, media attention shifted to other crimes, and Elijah's story faded to small columns. The Perez family, exhausted after months of police interaction, refused to give up. Maria called Moore weekly, sometimes just to ask if anything new had surfaced. Daniel returned to work after a leave, but barely spoke to anyone. Their home grew quiet. Elijah's room remained untouched. Toys in place, bedding neatly folded in the crib. At the end of each month they visited the police station to submit update requests. Moore always received them, brief, polite, never offering false hope. "We're still watching," he would say, knowing the file now sat in TBI's steel cabinets among hundreds of others. In early 1987, TBI placed the Elijah Perez case on active review status, meaning it would be re-examined if new technology or data emerged. A technician inspected stored evidence, confirming preservation standards were met. Hair samples remained intact in sealed vials. The central lab verified that current DNA methods were still too insensitive for such small hair samples, but recommended continued storage. From then on, Elijah Perez's name appeared annually in TBI internal reports with the same note. No new leads. By December, the case was officially designated a cold case inactive, awaiting conditions for reactivation. Moore, reassigned to another unit, kept a copy of the original report in his personal locker. He knew such cases often slipped into obscurity, but believed one day a single piece of evidence might reopen everything. The Perez family no longer appeared in the press, yet occasionally at local church prayer services, Maria was seen lighting a candle for her son, while Daniel stood silently beside her. They carried on, like hundreds of other families who had endured loss, but every letter sent to TBI contained the same plea. Please do not close our case. And in the state archive, among thousands of thick files, sat an old brown folder, hand-labeled Perez Elijah, Missing Child, Nashville, 1986. Next to it, a short note in black ink, Status, Unresolved. In the years after the case was officially transferred to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Perez family's life gradually slipped into silence. The winter of 1987 passed without any new information. Maria's phone calls to the TBI office grew fewer, but she still called faithfully once a month, asking the same question, have they found anything more? And year after year, the answer remained unchanged. No progress. Daniel returned to his job at the power company, but he became sullen and withdrawn, rarely speaking to neighbors. Many people in the neighborhood, who had once joined the search for Elijah, grew reluctant to even mention the child's name. They felt sympathy, but they also feared reopening the couple's wound. The small house on Maplewood Street remained exactly as it had been, as if time had frozen in the summer of 1986. Elijah's room became a place Maria visited every morning before work. She would open the window to let the light in and dust the old toys. She kept everything, the wool blanket, the remaining shoe, the family photo taken at his first birthday. Daniel rarely entered that room. Whenever Maria mentioned it, he fell silent. The two of them continued to live together, but shared little more than emptiness. By the early 1990s, as cable television expanded, other missing children cases constantly appeared on the news, and the name Elijah Perez was pushed to the bottom of the list. Newspapers stopped covering it. The missing person flyers faded on supermarket bulletin boards. In 1992, a local station re-aired a segment about the case, but after it aired, no useful calls came in. From then on, Elijah's file was classified as a cold case. At TBI headquarters in Nashville, the evidence box still sat in cold storage on shelf 14B, among hundreds of other missing persons cases. The label Perez 1986 had faded with time, but the inventory log still clearly listed 1 bag of hair, 1 gas receipt, 2 paint chips, 3 vials of mud, condition stable. Every year the forensics unit performed routine checks to ensure the integrity of the evidence. However, DNA technology at the time was still limited, and new cases consumed all available manpower. Harold Moore, after retiring in 1994, once visited his old colleagues at TBI and asked about Elijah's file. He was shown the latest note, no new data, insufficient grounds to reopen investigation. Moore nodded, understanding that the file might lie dormant for decades more. He kept a photograph of the Pontiac in a separate folder, as a reminder that sometimes silence is part of the story. By the late 1990s, Daniel died in a workplace accident. Maria received the news in the middle of her shift and arrived at the hospital just minutes too late. After the funeral, she sold the back lot but stayed in the same house. With no children, and now no husband, she lived alone, going to work and coming home. Occasionally, at Christmas, she sent cards to TBI, thanking them for still keeping my son's file. Those letters were kept in the case file, next to copies of the missing person report. In 2000, TBI moved its evidence warehouse to a new facility in western Nashville, and all old evidence, including the Perez file, was transferred to federally compliant cold storage. Every box was bar-coded and entered into an electronic database for easier retrieval, but that changed nothing in practice. No one was actively working the case. A young TBI employee wrote in the annual report, no progress case maintained in long-term storage. Meanwhile, Maria turned 50, her hair graying early, yet she still went to church every weekend and lit a candle at the altar beneath Elijah's black and white photo. Neighbors called her the waiting mother. Elijah's story was sometimes retold to newcomers in the neighborhood as a distant, sad memory. No one remembered the details clearly anymore. By 2010, nearly a quarter century had passed. The National Missing Persons Database still listed Elijah Perez, male, Caucasian, 1-year-old at disappearance, Nashville, Tennessee. In the status field, the simple word unresolved remained unchanged. Maria still called TBI once a year. Her voice grew hoarser with time, just to hear the duty officer repeat the familiar answer. "Yes, ma'am, the file is still active." She would thank them, hang up, and return to the old house where the crib still stood in the corner, clinging to the fragile belief that somewhere her little boy was still alive. While in Tennessee, the Elijah Perez file slowly sank into oblivion. In a small town in southern Arkansas, nearly 300 miles from Nashville, another child, now called Michael Thompson, was growing up in an old wooden house at the end of an unmarked dirt road. The man raising him, Richard Thompson, was an early retired mechanic who lived alone after his wife and newborn son died in a car accident in 1984. Neighbors rarely saw him leave the property, except to buy groceries or help out at an old auto shop outside town. When he suddenly appeared with a roughly 1-year-old boy in the summer of 1986, Richard told the few people who asked that the child was his grandson, sent to him after his daughter died in Texas. No one pressed further. In that small community, sad stories usually ended in silence. The house sat isolated between 2 rows of oak trees, with a rusty tin roof and a front yard cluttered with tarp-covered junk cars. Inside, the furnishings were sparse. A kitchen table, wooden chairs, an old radio, and a homemade pine crib. Richard never took the boy anywhere and never registered a birth at the local hospital. He simply hand-wrote a birth certificate, Michael Andrew Thompson, born May 5, 1985, parents Richard and Laura Thompson, and filed it at the Jefferson County Clerk's office, claiming a home birth. The paperwork was processed without verification. From then on, Elijah carried a new identity, Michael, and grew up in a completely closed world. Richard, who had worked in the mechanical trade, taught him how to fix engines, cut wood, recognize the smell of different oils, and to stay away from strangers. Every morning they ate the same thing, toast and fried eggs. Every afternoon Richard turned on the radio for news, but never turned on a television. Michael was slow to speak, his accent mixed Southern and Midwestern tones, and he sometimes used words even his guardian didn't know where he'd learned. When he reached school age, Richard didn't enroll him in public school. He taught him to read using old magazines and repair manuals. He said, "School isn't safe." The boy rarely left the property, only playing in the yard among bolts and scrap parts. At age 6, Michael asked why the neighbor kids went to school and he didn't. Richard answered curtly, "Because you're different." That answer stuck in the boy's memory. Occasionally, the mail carrier or a utility worker would glimpse a fair-haired, brown-eyed child peeking from behind the door. They'd wave, but Richard always answered for him. Years passed, and their life barely changed. They had no telephone, no television, just oil lamps and an old pickup truck. Richard took local repair jobs from farmers, and Michael helped, cleaning parts with gasoline and wiping his hands on rags. He grew tall, smart, careful with his work, but almost incapable of casual conversation. Neighbors only knew them as those odd Thompsons, the quiet old man and the son who never left the yard. Only once, when Michael was about 10, did they go together to the farmer's market in Pine Bluff. He watched other children laughing and holding their mother's hands, and he was silent the whole way home. Richard noticed and warned sternly, "Never tell anyone about yourself." Inside the house, the only photo on the wall was Richard's wedding picture with his late wife. There were no pictures of Michael, no new toys, no birthday gifts. Everything was kept minimal, as if Richard were trying to maintain a stillness that drew no attention. Still, signs of strain were obvious. Richard often suffered insomnia, drank in the evenings, and sometimes muttered to himself in the garage. Michael overheard fragments. "I did the right thing. Nobody knows." He didn't understand and learned to keep his distance. As a teenager, Michael began to feel different, but didn't dare ask questions. He had no official documents, no school ID, no social security number, just the yellowed handwritten birth certificate. When he was sick, Richard treated him with over-the-counter medicine. When neighbors asked about school, Richard said he was homeschooling on a special program. Local authorities checked once in 1997, but found no specific violations and let it go. In a small town, no one wanted to pry into someone else's business. By 2000, Michael was 15, taller than his foster father, thin but quick. He started doing odd repair jobs around the area and earning pocket money. Everyone liked his work ethic, but no one really knew who he was. When asked about his mother, he said he didn't remember. She had died when he was little. At night, Richard still locked the doors from the inside, drew the curtains tight, and double-checked the locks before bed. That life lasted nearly 20 years in the wooden house on the flat, quiet land, where the only sounds were cicadas and clanging metal. Elijah, now Michael Thompson, grew up like a shadow, with no friends, no clear memories of a past, only a vague feeling that something in his life wasn't real. At the end of 2005, when Michael turned 20, the closed-off life between the two of them remained unchanged, except that Richard Thompson's health was steadily declining. He suffered long coughing spells, his hands shook when working with tools, and he had to rest more often. One afternoon, while picking up mail, Richard stopped by the Jefferson County Clerk's office, where he had registered Michael's birth nearly 20 years earlier, and requested a new certified copy, saying he needed it for property insurance paperwork to prove the father-son relationship. The clerk asked no questions, processed it quickly, and handed over a freshly printed certificate with the same information, son born in 1985 in Pine Bluff, to Richard and Laura Thompson. When he got home, Richard carefully placed it in an envelope and locked it in the metal cabinet with the savings book and truck title. That piece of paper would later become the strangest puzzle piece in Michael's story. By this time, Michael was starting to sense something wrong with his own identity. Several times when he applied for jobs, employers turned him down because his paperwork didn't match any social security records. When he asked Richard, the old man just said, "Old paperwork, they don't know how to look it up." But Michael noticed the handwritten certificate had no raised seal, and on the new printed copy the mother's name looked slightly different. The typed letters were fainter, as if overprinted on something underneath that couldn't quite be read. He quietly compared the two and spotted subtle alterations. Laura Thompson had been typed over another, nearly erased line. From then on, doubt grew, but Richard dodged every question. He became short-tempered. Whenever Michael brought up the paperwork, he snapped that the past should stay buried. Once, while drunk, he muttered, "I had to do it, or I'd lose another child." The words stunned Michael, but he didn't dare ask what they meant. In the winter of 2009, Richard's health deteriorated rapidly. He was diagnosed with heart failure but refused hospitalization, staying home with painkillers. Michael worked at a nearby shop and spent most of his free time caring for him. One night in February 2010, when Michael returned from his shift, the house lights were still on and the door unlocked. Richard was slumped in his living room chair, still clutching a glass of water. The doctor confirmed cardiac arrest, no signs of foul play. The funeral was small, only a few neighbors attended. After authorities finished the paperwork, Michael was recognized as the sole heir to the wooden house. He began cleaning, gathering old things to sell. While sorting documents, he found the yellowed envelope deep inside the metal cabinet. Inside were 3 items: the 1986 handwritten birth certificate, the 2005 printed copy, and a small torn slip of paper with scrawled notes. Jefferson County Clerk, Birth Record Amendment, Ref. 4D219. In the corner was a faint stamp and an illegible signature. Under the yellow light, Michael saw that the 2 certificates showed different birth dates, 1 year apart from what Richard had always told him. The place of birth on both said Pine Bluff, but the torn slip had a crossed-out note underneath, Tennessee, tied 1986. Holding the 3 papers, a chill ran down his spine. He had known his foster father hid things, but he never imagined his very origin was one of them. He laid the documents out on the table, trying to piece together the faint erased letters, but could make out only scattered characters. In the days that followed, while continuing to clean, he found another old envelope in a desk drawer containing several faded photographs, a red car parked in front of a garage with a blurred license plate, and a picture of a brown-haired woman holding a newborn baby. The woman's face was unclear, only her hands wearing a silver ring were visible. When he looked closely, Michael realized it was not a picture of Richard's late wife. The wedding photo still hanging on the wall showed Laura with light hair. He placed the 2 pictures side by side, 2 different women. Unease spread through his mind, but there was no one to ask. After settling the inheritance, Michael decided to fix up the house, but left Richard's little workshop untouched. In a corner of the desk, he found one more sealed torn envelope with no addressee, only faint writing, from Nashville, Tennessee. Inside were old receipts and a corner-cut map fragment. Nothing directly incriminating, but taken together they made him understand that his origin story was far more complicated than Richard had ever admitted. On the last night, before burning a pile of torn papers, Michael kept the birth certificates, the photographs, and the map piece. He locked them in the metal box. Outside, a spring wind blew, carrying the distant sound of a train whistle. He stood alone in the old wooden house, the oil lamp flickering shadows on the walls, thinking of the things Richard had said, the gaps that could never be filled, and the feeling that everything around him had been a shell built to hide a truth that had lain dormant for years. After Richard Thompson's death, Michael lived alone in the old wooden house on the outskirts of Jefferson, carrying a jumble of mismatched documents and questions that had no answers. At first he tried to continue a normal life, fixing cars for hire, working at the small shop, but every time he opened the metal cabinet and saw the 2 conflicting birth certificates and the photo of the unknown woman holding a baby, the emptiness returned. He began to think seriously about searching for his real origins. One evening, while browsing on an old computer, Michael came across an article about commercial DNA testing services that could find relatives through genetic databases. The article mentioned a well-known California company that let users mail in a saliva sample to trace ancestry. The idea haunted him for days. In his mind appeared the image of the woman in the faded photo, her smile unfamiliar, yet somehow comforting. Still, he hesitated. He feared that if he took the test, everything Richard had told him would collapse, and the unanswered questions would become an unbearable burden. Many times he filled out the online form, only to delete it, torn between the desire for truth and fear that the past might destroy the few memories he had of the man who raised him. In the end, he only bookmarked the page and wrote down the customer service number, then left it. Whenever he had time, Michael read more stories of people identified or reunited through DNA after decades, lost or missing persons finding family again. Each story left him with a vague mixture of hope and doubt. He casually asked older neighbors if they knew where the Thompsons originally came from, but everyone said Richard had been an outsider who moved from somewhere in the East and kept to himself. When Michael went to the county office for copies of property records, the clerk told him the house had been paid for in cash, no mortgage, no co-owners. Tax records showed Richard had first claimed Michael Thompson as a dependent in 1987. The same year the child appeared in the area. That line on the form stopped Michael cold. Everything lined up perfectly, too perfectly, to feel genuine. Yet that very perfection made him feel like a stranger to himself. One day at the town supermarket, he overheard 2 people talking about a Tennessee documentary series that reopened old missing children cases using DNA technology. He wrote down the name Tennessee Bureau of Investigation without realizing that, more than 20 years earlier, the file of Elijah Perez, the child taken from Nashville, still sat untouched in cold storage there. At the same time, In TBI headquarters in Nashville, the newly appointed leadership had launched the Cold Case Digital Recovery Initiative to digitize all unsolved cases from the 1970s through the 1990s. Hundreds of boxes of documents, physical evidence, videotapes, and biological samples were pulled from the old warehouse for inventory. The forensics lab partnered with federal agencies and Othram Science in Texas, which had developed next-generation sequencing capable of extracting DNA from tiny or degraded samples. Young technicians were assigned to the project, including Grace Holloway, a forensic analyst formerly with the FBI. She was tasked with reviewing the 1980s unresolved child abduction cases group, assessing whether each evidence sample was viable for modern testing. Among them was file number Perez #86-1021. Inside the still-sealed box from 1986 were glass vials of hair, red paint chips, a gas receipt, and Lieutenant Harold Moore's handwritten notes. Grace marked it good condition, suitable for analysis if requested. The file was then placed on the processing waitlist with dozens of others. But at least it was no longer forgotten. While TBI technicians began working through mountains of old files, in Arkansas, Michael continued struggling with his unclear life. He researched how to obtain new identity documents, but when county officials asked for proof of parentage, he had nothing valid to show. The old birth certificate had no verification code. Everything existed only on paper, with no foundation. Every time he read the line, Michael Andrew Thompson, born Pine Bluff, 1985, he felt he was reading someone else's name. That feeling grew stronger and pushed him toward answers. On long nights, with crickets chirping outside the window, Michael took out the photo of the unknown woman again. Something in her eyes made him think of what he had never had, a real memory of a mother. But everything stopped there, like a darkness he could not reach. Elsewhere, in a cold Nashville laboratory, old evidence boxes were being rearranged on metal shelves. Among hundreds of faded labels was a dark brown box marked Elijah Perez, missing child, 1986. No one in that room knew that, hundreds of miles away, the very child from that file was beginning to wonder who he really was. In early 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officially launched Project Reconnect, a collaborative program between TBI and the Forensic Science Institute, Othram, aimed at re-examining missing persons cases that had remained unsolved for more than 3 decades, using next-generation DNA technology to establish identity or blood relationships. The project was rolled out as the state of Tennessee modernized its entire forensic database system, focusing on cases with biological samples that had been stored long enough to be recoverable. Among hundreds of boxes of old files pulled from cold storage, the Forensic Analysis Team's special unit, led by technician Grace Holloway, was assigned to review the group labeled Unresolved Child Abduction Cases. Grace, 32 years old, and formerly with the Federal Laboratory in Washington, was renowned for her skill in handling degraded DNA samples. She and her colleagues carefully examined each box, cross-referencing inventories with electronic archives and assessing the viability of evidence recovery. When they reached shelf 14B, Grace noticed an old box still sealed with red wax. The handwritten label Perez #86-1021 had almost completely faded. This file had no updates since 1987, and the exterior notes contained only 3 lines: Pontiac vehicle, hair sample, gas receipt. She placed the box on the table, put on latex gloves, and carefully peeled back the preservation tape. Inside, everything remained in its original order: a glass vial containing light-colored hair strands, sealed in a nylon bag, a red paint chip from the vehicle, a Brentwood gas receipt, and a copy of the report by Lieutenant Harold Moore. Every piece of evidence was sequentially numbered in now faded marker, but still legible. Grace checked the storage temperature log, steady at 3.8 degrees Celsius, for 35 years. That meant the sample remained viable for genetic analysis. She logged the details into the inventory and recommended transferring the hair to Othram Labs in the Woodlands, Texas, which possessed the most advanced YSTR and autosomal DNA analysis platform in the country. In her submission memo, she wrote briefly, "Hair sample well preserved, likely contains nuclear or mitochondrial DNA. Recommend mixed extraction protocol or SHD-12 for sequence recovery." Once approved, the sample was packed in an insulated container with federal transport documentation and shipped in the project's first batch. At Othram's laboratory, the sample was received under a unique case identifier. Technicians began pre-processing, separating the cuticle, dissolving proteins, and extracting DNA from the hair shaft. Initial analysis revealed heavily fragmented DNA strands with fewer than 200 base pairs remaining. However, the latest generation nanopore sequencing technology allowed small fragments to be stitched together into longer sequences. Preliminary results detected sufficient markers from 2 genetic profiles, one male and one non-gender-specific autosomal profile, suggesting a maternal source. From Nashville, Grace monitored progress through the internal data portal. In her weekly report, she noted, Perez #86-1021 sample. Initial sequencing indicates high probability of successful extraction. To ensure accuracy, Othram ran parallel processes, YS-TER analysis to trace the paternal line, and autosomal DNA for extended family matching through commercial genetic databases. Preliminary results were completed after 4 weeks, confirming the hair contained sufficient genetic data for comparison. Back in the Nashville office, Grace and her team received the electronic report. The chart showed hundreds of restored marker locations, most stable and meeting upload standards. She submitted a request for cross-checking against the National CODIS database, but no matches were found since the sample was not from a criminal perpetrator. Next, she prepared the data for upload to commercial genealogical DNA platforms, where millions of voluntary consumer samples could be searched. Project Reconnect had been designed precisely for this purpose, using science to reconnect decades-old broken links. As she finished the electronic submission form, Grace paused at the line case. Perez Elijah. 36 years had passed since that child vanished, and now a single strand of hair was the only remaining trace of his existence. She knew many other cases in storage had begun the same way. An old sample, an old file, yet sometimes the smallest things unlocked entire buried stories. The next day, technical confirmation arrived from Texas. The DNA from Perez #86-1021 was upload ready for the National Genealogical Database. Only minimal additional geographic data was needed. Grace submitted the notification to her division chief, received approval to advance the sample to Phase 2, and every step was logged in the electronic case file with date, time, analyst, method, and status. The final line in her log #47 read, Case Perez #86-1021. Hair DNA extraction completed. YS-TER and autosomal DNA successfully sequenced. Awaiting genealogical upload. That log page was printed, clipped into the original folder, marking the first turning point in a journey spanning nearly half a century, when a seemingly meaningless artifact was finally awakened by modern technology. While Othram's lab in Texas was completing the final analysis phase of the hair from case Perez #86-1021, more than 500 miles away, Michael Thompson, the man whose every document listed him as born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, was sitting in his small living room staring at his computer screen. After months of hesitation, he had finally ordered a consumer DNA test through 23andMe, hoping to learn something about his origins. The kit arrived a few days later with instructions for a saliva sample. Michael read the directions over and over before swabbing, his hand trembling slightly as he sealed the tube and mailed it back. He told himself it was just a test, but deep down he knew this was the first time in his life he had actively sought the truth. 2 months later, the results email arrived. The platform displayed a genetic ancestry chart with a few distant relatives, but what caught Michael's attention was an unusually high match of 49.7%, consistent with a parent or full sibling. Beneath the match, a note read, "Possible match with existing law enforcement database, further confirmation required." He was confused. unsure why his data would be linked to an investigation. A few days later, 23andMe sent another email stating his profile had been selected for comparison under a federal missing persons identification program and requesting identity verification and consent to share data. Michael signed the online form, unaware that almost simultaneously, in Nashville, Grace Holloway received an alert from Othram about a new profile that had auto-matched in the system. The report stated clearly, autosomal DNA from case Perez, #861021, shows 99.998% match with profile M. Thompson registered via 23andMe. She immediately pulled the original data and cross-referenced it with the Perez family reference stored in TBI's bank since the 1990s. When Maria Perez had voluntarily submitted a blood sample during a statewide missing persons campaign, the software confirmed complete alignment. The YSTR matched the paternal line perfectly, and the autosomal profile aligned at every locus with Maria's DNA. Grace stared at the screen, heart racing. The statistical probability left no room for error. This was Maria Perez's son, the child who disappeared in 1986. She printed the report, signed it, and forwarded it to the head of forensic investigation. The document had 3 sections: sample source, analyzing agency, and conclusion of first-degree biological relationship. The final line read, "The male individual identified as Michael Thompson is a direct biological match to Maria Perez, mother of missing child Elijah Perez, Nashville, Tennessee. Case #861021. The file was immediately sent to the TBI director and Othram's Institute head for cross-verification. Within 24 hours, an emergency meeting was convened at TBI headquarters in Nashville with representatives from the National Missing Persons Identification Unit, the FBI, and the Davidson County District Attorney's Office. Grace presented the entire analytical process, from discovering the old box in storage to the genealogical match. She emphasized that the match exceeded legal standards and ruled out any possibility of error. After reviewing all evidence, the TBI director signed the official order, reclassification notice. Case #861021, status changed from cold case to active case. The file was reopened after 36 years on ice, marking the first concrete progress since 1986 in the disappearance of Elijah Perez. Federal agencies were notified, and the national databases NamUs and NCIC were updated simultaneously. Identified, biological confirmation pending secondary verification. At the same time, Grace sent an internal email to the Othram team, thanking them for technical support and confirming their data had produced the biggest breakthrough of Project Reconnect to date. In her summary to superiors, she wrote, "After more than 3 decades, the sole hair from the red Pontiac crime scene has led to successful victim identification. This case demonstrates the power of DNA technology and the value of long-term evidence preservation." As she shut down her computer, Grace sat quietly for a long time, fully aware that the numbers she had just seen were not merely scientific results, but proof that a life lost for far too long had finally been found. In a different place, Michael Thompson still had no idea that the DNA inside him had just awakened an old file in Nashville, and that his real name was about to be spoken again after 36 years of silence. Immediately after case Perez #861021 was reclassified as active case, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation initiated real-world identity verification of the individual named Michael Thompson, the person whose DNA perfectly matched the evidence in the 1986 disappearance of Elijah Perez. Othram's internal report provided the registered address linked to the 23andMe account, located in Warren County, Kentucky, where Michael currently lived and worked at a small auto repair shop. Additional federal database checks showed he had a valid driver's license, steady tax records, and no criminal history. To avoid causing alarm, TBI coordinated with local police for a discreet approach. On the morning of March 14, 2022, the investigative task force traveled to Bowling Green, Kentucky. Grace Holloway was present, carrying the DNA file and a court-ordered warrant from Tennessee for a confirmatory biological sample. They approached Michael at his workplace through the shop manager and briefly informed him they needed to verify his identity. Michael initially appeared anxious, thinking it was a paperwork issue, but fell silent when he saw the TBI credentials. In a private room, the lead officer explained they were conducting a federal genetic comparison and needed a confirmatory sample to rule out error. Michael agreed to cooperate and signed the consent form. A buccal swab was taken on site, sealed, and express shipped to TBI's Nashville lab within 6 hours. The entire procedure was video recorded for legality. While awaiting results, the team conducted a preliminary interview. Michael described his life in Arkansas, being raised by Richard Thompson, and his recent suspicions about his origins. He had no knowledge of any disappearance in Tennessee, only saying, "Everything about my past has always been foggy." His statement was recorded and added to the file. 2 days later, the TBI DNA lab results landed on Grace Holloway's desk. The comparison chart showed a 99.7% genetic match with Maria Perez's reference sample stored since 1994. The YSTR profile aligned perfectly with the 1986 Pontiac hair. The report concluded succinctly, "Biological relationship confirmed." The individual known as Michael Thompson is genetically identical to missing child Elijah Perez. Grace printed 3 copies, signed them, and forwarded them to the TBI director and the state prosecutor for official notification. An internal briefing was held that same afternoon. On the large command room screen, a 1986 photo of Elijah was displayed side by side with current photos of Michael. Facial recognition software highlighted matching points with glowing dots, eye contours, jaw structure, a small scar near the left eyebrow. The alignment was nearly perfect. There was no longer any doubt. The man who had lived more than 30 years as Michael Thompson was Elijah Perez, the child taken from the Galaxy Lanes bowling alley in Nashville. The official announcement was issued the next morning to the FBI, Department of Justice, and NamUs system. Case status was updated, identified. Elijah Perez located alive, verification complete. In the internal log, Grace added one line, "After 36 years, the missing child has been identified." For her, it was not just a scientific outcome, but proof of the deepest purpose of forensic work, restoring identity to people erased by time. In Bowling Green, Michael was asked to meet TBI representatives a second time to receive the official results. When he heard the first words, "You are not Michael Thompson. Your birth name is Elijah Perez, born in Nashville, Tennessee, missing since 1986. He froze, gripping the edge of the table. Grace, who was present, later recalled the room was completely silent for over a minute. Michael looked down at the DNA report and whispered, "I don't know what to believe anymore." TBI gave him time to process and simultaneously opened a separate investigation into the actions of Richard Thompson, who had died in 2010. All of Michael's personal records were converted to his true birth name, Elijah Perez, and updated across federal systems. On March 18th, the TBI director signed the final affirmation. Elijah Perez, identified alive after 36 years, case status PAVA reinvestigation. It marked the end of nearly 4 decades as a frozen cold case and the most significant breakthrough in Tennessee investigative history since Project Reconnect began. Elijah Perez, the 1-year-old boy who vanished without a trace from a Nashville bowling alley in 1986, had finally been found, living under another name in another state, completely unaware he had once been at the center of one of America's strangest missing child cases. After confirming Elijah Perez's true identity, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation reopened the entire original file to reconstruct Richard Thompson's movements during the summer of 1986, when the child was abducted. The goal of the reinvestigation was to map the route from Nashville to Arkansas using the physical evidence, receipts, and archived records. A special investigative team led by Grace Holloway worked with the Historical Traffic Analysis Unit and federal records offices. From the gas receipt recovered from the red Pontiac, time-stamped 10:49 p.m. on June 12, 1986, at the Brentwood station, the analysts determined this was the first stop after leaving Galaxy Lane's bowling alley. By retrieving old business microfilm, they located the accounting ledger from Brentwood Fuel Mart, showing a $15 cash transaction at that exact time. There were no security cameras in that era, but the night clerk's handwritten log noted, red Pontiac, male driver did not get out of vehicle, small child in back seat. That brief note, after more than 3 decades, became definitive proof that Richard had Elijah with him when he left Nashville. From Brentwood, route analysis determined the most likely path was westbound I-40 toward Little Rock, Arkansas. Cross-referencing Tennessee Department of Transportation toll records from 1986 revealed a handwritten entry by a toll booth worker in Jackson, Tennessee. Red Pontiac, plate 4D, partial plate only, time-stamped 1:36 a.m. on June 13. Distance and timing matched perfectly for continuous overnight travel from Nashville. Upon reaching Little Rock, Richard stopped in a north side residential area near Highway 67, the same location where the Pontiac was later found abandoned. By pulling 1986 cadastral maps and Pulaski County property records, investigators confirmed the area once contained a private parking lot and small repair shop where Richard had briefly worked, according to his 1987 tax filings. This supported the theory that his trip to Arkansas was planned, not random. Social Security records showed Richard began reporting income in Jefferson County by late June 1986. Only 2 weeks after the abduction, indicating he continued directly south from Little Rock to what became his long-term residence. Every time stamp and location aligned without suspicious gaps. Grace requested additional background checks through federal agencies to determine whether Richard had accomplices. The FBI Criminal Records Division responded that Richard Thompson had no prior convictions, no known associations with any organizations, and had never been investigated in any other case. Former neighbors in Jefferson recalled him as reclusive, with no close friends or visitors. Some vaguely remembered him mentioning that he had lost a young son, a chilling coincidence with Elijah's situation. When all data points, travel route, timing, receipts, logs, and witness statements were compiled, the team concluded Richard acted alone. There was no evidence of assistance during the abduction or transport. He owned his own vehicle, knew the interstate system well, and appeared capable of meticulous planning to avoid detection. The total distance from Brentwood to Jefferson was over 340 miles, about 6 hours of driving. Enough time to exit the initial search radius before police could establish roadblocks. Supporting TBI documents noted the Pontiac may have been purchased privately without title transfer, a common practice at the time that made tracing nearly impossible. The final synthesized report concluded, route Nashville, Brentwood, Little Rock, Jefferson confirmed as sole travel path. No evidence of accomplices. Lone actor incident. The report was attached with detailed maps, timelines, and digitized images of the gas receipt, then forwarded to the Tennessee State Prosecutor's Office. In her closing remarks, Grace Holloway wrote, Richard Thompson executed a deliberate pre-planned relocation consistent with a lone individual acting on personal motive without organizational involvement. As she closed the file, she knew that although the man had been dead for over a decade, his journey remained clearly visible, like a single thread running through 3 states. The road he took with the missing child, the beginning of a tragedy that lasted more than 3 decades, and had only now been pieced together from scattered fragments of the past. After reconstructing the entire travel route of Richard Thompson, the TBI investigation team shifted focus to analyzing the man's medical and psychological records in order to determine the deeper cause that led to the abduction of Elijah Perez in 1986. Based on declassified Social Security data and hospital records obtained through court order, they discovered that Richard had been admitted twice to St. Vincent Hospital in Little Rock in late 1984 and early 1985, just 1 year before the disappearance. Treatment records showed he was diagnosed with severe major depressive disorder, with traumatic reaction following the deaths of his wife and newborn son in a highway crash on U.S. Route 30 near Benton. The physician's report clearly stated, patient exhibits disorientation and mild paranoia about still hearing the baby crying in the house. Richard was prescribed sedatives and received 8 weeks of psychological counseling, then voluntarily discharged himself and refused follow-up visits. In the psychiatric file there was a note, patient displays obsessive attachment to the father role image, stating a father should never lose his child, no matter what. That statement was later regarded by the investigative team as the key to explaining his actions. When cross-referencing his work log at the machine shop where Richard had been employed, TBI noted that after his discharge, he began to change his habits. He rarely spoke, kept his distance from coworkers, and showed signs of fixation on young children. A former coworker recalled seeing Richard stand for a very long time in front of a children's toy store in downtown Little Rock, staring blankly. This information led TBI forensic psychologists to build a behavioral profile. The preliminary conclusion stated that Richard Thompson was likely suffering from complicated grief disorder, resulting in a need to replace the lost love object with another child. The specialist described this as a rare abduction motive in which the perpetrator does not act for financial or sexual gain, but out of unhealed psychological trauma. Upon expanding the medical search, they discovered Richard had briefly attended a bereavement support group at Grace Baptist Church in North Little Rock in 1985, but left after a few weeks. One group member recalled that he always carried a photograph of his infant son and said, "I won't leave that crib empty forever." These statements matched the period immediately before he left Arkansas for Tennessee, where he began seasonal work in the Brentwood industrial area, only a few miles from the abduction site. Tax records and travel documentation showed he was living in temporary housing nearby during the exact period of April through June 1986, giving him ample opportunity to observe the bowling alley and plan the act. TBI psychologists concluded that Richard chose Elijah deliberately because the boy was the same age as his deceased son, and the abduction was a purposeful replacement act, not impulsive. The final section of the behavioral analysis read, motive replacement of deceased child, replacement child syndrome, conduct calculated, non-violent, stemming from cognitive distortion regarding loss. This evidence explained why Richard treated and cared for Elijah well over the years without causing harm, and it reinforced TBI's conclusion that he acted alone, with no accomplices and no connection to organized crime. On the basis of the collected data, the Tennessee District Attorney completed a posthumous indictment to formally record criminal responsibility for Richard Thompson, even though he had been dead for more than 10 years. The indictment was filed to preserve legal integrity of the case file and carried symbolic value in closing the matter. The document stated, Defendant Richard Allen Thompson, born 1943, deceased 2010 in Jefferson County, Arkansas. Charge: aggravated kidnapping of a child under Tennessee Code Annotated Section 3913-303. Determined motive: replacement of deceased child, absent violence or exploitation. Once the indictment was signed and archived, the case was officially reclassified as resolved, posthumous conviction not pursued. For TBI, this was the only way to end a story that had lasted more than 30 years and to give Elijah Perez the truth he could never have learned from the man who raised him. In the final summary, Grace Holloway wrote, Richard Thompson was not evil in the conventional sense. He was a man so haunted by loss that he crossed moral boundaries. But whatever the motive, the consequence remained a stolen life. Those closing words ended Richard's medical file section, marking the moment TBI completed the psychological investigation phase and moved the case to the next step in the review process. Once the posthumous indictment was officially signed and Richard Thompson's legal file was completed, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation entered the final phase, public announcement of the investigation results, and confirmation of Elijah Perez's true identity. After more than 36 years since that fateful night in 1986, the case was considered solved. On May 4, 2022, the TBI director held a press conference at headquarters in Nashville, attended by FBI representatives, the state prosecutor, the forensics lab, and the Project Reconnect team. Behind the podium stood a large board reading, Case 86-1021, resolved. In front of the media, the director read a short but emotional statement. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation confirms that the individual known as Michael Thompson, residing in Kentucky, is in fact Elijah Perez, the child who disappeared from Nashville on June 12, 1986. DNA testing and investigative records show a perfect match with the Perez family genetic profile. The sole suspect in the case, Richard Thompson, died in 2010. The investigation determined he acted alone, motivated by psychological trauma following the loss of his own child. The room fell completely silent except for the constant click of camera shutters. Grace Holloway sat in the front row, quietly bowing her head. For her, this was not only marked the end of a case but proof of the value of preserving even the smallest piece of evidence, no matter how much time had passed. After the press conference, TBI sent formal notification to the Perez family, now only Maria, the mother who had lived alone for 3 decades. The letter was hand-delivered through secure channel by the TBI director and Grace themselves. When they arrived at the small house on the outskirts of Nashville, Maria was over 70, her hair completely white, her frame frail, but her eyes still bright. She invited them into the living room, where her son's photograph still hung on the wall exactly as it had for decades. When the director began reading the first lines, "We believe your son Elijah Perez is alive," her hands began to shake and tears welled up before he could finish. She sat in silence for a long time, then whispered, I always knew he was somewhere." Grace sat beside her, holding her hand, explaining each step: the DNA match, the investigative journey, and how Othram Labs had recovered data from the decades-old hair sample. Maria listened intently, eyes wet but never leaving the photo on the table. When she heard the name Richard Thompson, she lowered her head, as if both forgiving and understanding. "He raised him?" she asked. And upon hearing, "Yes, he cared for him his whole life," she nodded gently, voice breaking. "Then at least my son got to live." The meeting lasted more than an hour, after which TBI outlined the official reunification process, including biological identification, confirmation, psychological interviews, and media preparation. They asked her to avoid direct contact with reporters until verification was complete. Maria agreed, with only one request: "Please let me see him, even if just once." In the following days, TBI coordinated with Kentucky authorities to finalize legal recognition of Elijah Perez's identity. Identity protection agencies updated all documents while preparing for the first meeting between Maria and Elijah in 36 years. Grace was appointed coordinator, accompanied by a psychologist for support. Inside TBI, the atmosphere was solemn, yet deeply moving. Many staff members had been born after the abduction, but had followed the file during digitization. They told each other, "This is why we do this job." The press covered the story heavily, but investigators released only basic confirmed information, protecting Elijah's current identity and privacy. Local television stations replayed 1986 footage interspersed with old Galaxy Lane's crime scene shots, beneath headlines reading "Missing Boy Found Alive." After 36 years, hundreds of comments offered congratulations and hope. Meanwhile, at a counseling center in Kentucky, Elijah was being prepared for the upcoming meeting. He still could not fully believe he was the child in the photograph, but the documents, the DNA, and the story of the red Pontiac made it undeniable. He wrote a short letter to TBI that read only 4 lines. "I don't know where to begin, but if this is real, thank you for not forgetting." When Grace received it, she carefully clipped it into the file next to her final handwritten note. Case status verified. Pending family reunion. The appointment was set for late that month in a private conference room at TBI headquarters in Nashville. Both parties were thoroughly briefed on the reunion process to ensure safety and emotional stability. The night before, Maria sat in her old room rereading the letters she had sent TBI over the years. Letters that had once received only the reply, "No progress." Now everything was different. Outside, Nashville streetlights reflected through the window, hazy as if time itself were turning backward. And in TBI's system, the very last status line had just been updated. Elijah Perez, located alive. Family, notified. Reunion, in preparation. On May 27, 2022, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Nashville opened its doors to two people who shared the same last name but had been separated by time for more than half a century. In the third-floor conference room, soft lighting, half-drawn curtains, a small vase of flowers, and 2 cups of tea on the table. Maria Perez, now 73, sat quietly holding the old knitted blanket she had once used for baby Elijah. She was supported by the psychologist and by Grace Holloway, who had accompanied the case throughout. When the door opened, a man in his early 40s entered, tall, dark brown hair, eyes cautious yet bewildered. No introduction was needed. Maria recognized him instantly. Though the years had changed him, those eyes, brown, deep, and gentle, were still the eyes of the child in the picture she had kept for 55 years. Nothing was said for the first few seconds, only the soft tick of the wall clock. Then she stood, hands trembling, and walked slowly toward him. Elijah, or Michael, as everyone had known him, stood frozen, lips moving, but no sound coming out. When she touched his cheek, the silence broke. They embraced, sobbing, muffled cries mixing with shaking breaths. Behind them, Grace and the specialists simply stood still, letting the moment unfold without interference. After nearly 4 decades torn apart by time and tragedy, mother and son were finally reunited. When they sat down, the official verification proceeded in quiet solemnity. The TBI representative read the confirmation minutes. DNA comparison confirms a first-degree biological relationship between Maria Perez and Elijah Perez, previously known as Michael Thompson. A legal specialist handed Elijah a folder containing the identification certificate, a copy of his original birth certificate, and the order restoring his identity. At the top of the page, Elijah Daniel Perez was printed in bold letters, followed by Nashville, Tennessee, United States. He stared at it for a long time, as if trying to reclaim a piece of memory that had been stolen. Maria looked at him and said softly, "You're home now." Everyone present, though accustomed to emotional situations, could not hold back tears. After the verification, TBI permitted limited media filming. The conference room door opened, cameras focused on mother and son, not as a sensational story, but as a symbol of perseverance and justice. They sat side by side, hands clasped, bathed in soft white light. When a reporter asked for their feelings, Maria answered briefly, "I've waited more than half my life for this day." Elijah simply said, "I didn't know how much I had lost, but today I got everything back." Those simple words brought a moment of silence to the room, followed by soft applause. Outside, the Nashville community gathered in front of TBI headquarters, holding candles and flowers. They came not only to witness, but to thank an investigation that had spanned 3 generations of officers. Volunteers from the original 1986 search, now with gray hair, watched the press conference on a large outdoor screen. Images of the mother embracing her long-lost son aired on national news, becoming one of the rare American missing person cases resolved after 55 years. Local stations broadcast live, but TBI tightly controlled content, allowing filming only for a short approved window to protect family privacy. As they left the room, Maria and Elijah walked slowly down the hallway, while TBI staff lined both sides in silent salute, heads bowed as they passed. Grace Holloway followed, eyes filled with emotion, still holding the folder that had been with her for 2 years. When they reached the lobby, sunlight streamed through the glass and reflected off the brass TBI logo plaque. Elijah paused, looked around, then said quietly to Grace, "If it weren't for you, I might never have known who I really am." She answered, voice breaking, "No, Elijah, you found yourself." Outside, the crowd applauded as mother and son stepped out. Maria held her son's hand tightly, saying nothing, only smiling through tears. Elijah bowed to the crowd, then turned for one last look at the building, as if closing the door on the past. That night, newspapers in Nashville, Memphis, and the New York Times all ran the same headline: "Missing boy found alive after 55 years." The photograph of the Perez mother and son became an icon of faith and persistence. In a short interview, the TBI director said, "This is not only a victory for science, but a victory for the human heart." And in the small house where Maria had lived alone for so many years, the window light was turned on again, shining onto the old photograph that now had the real person standing beside it. That reunion did not merely close a case. It opened reconciliation after half a century for lives torn apart by fate. Immediately following the emotional reunion between Maria Perez and Elijah, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation began the final phase of the case, compiling all data, test results, and statements into the official closing report. This is a mandatory procedure for every case classified as resolved to ensure historical investigative integrity. Grace Holloway, who had followed the case for 2 years, was assigned as lead author. In the records storage room at TBI headquarters in Nashville, she sat surrounded by stacks of documents, the 1986 crime scene reports, Othram Labs findings, DNA comparison charts, Elijah's statement, and Richard Thompson's posthumous indictment. Every document was coded and entered into the central digital system. The very first line of the report introduction read, "Case #86-1021, Elijah Perez, male missing child, Nashville, Tennessee, 1986. Status, solved." In the summary section, Grace listed the entire investigative timeline in detail, beginning with the evening of June 12, 1986, at Galaxy Lanes Bowling Alley. The timeline recorded each milestone: 10:45 p.m. Elijah Perez disappears. 11:10 p.m. Police arrive at scene. 3:15 a.m. Tire tracks and child shoe discovered. 6 a.m. Initial search suspended. September 1986. Case transferred to TBI. July 1987. Classified unresolved child abduction. Then came the chain of events, stretching across 3 decades. 2010. Richard Thompson dies. 2021. Project Reconnect launched. 2022. DNA match via 23andMe sample. May 4, 2022. TBI announces Elijah Perez identity. May 27. Identification confirmed and family reunited. Below the timeline was a 5-column technical summary: 1 physical evidence, 2 biological test results, 3 genetic genealogy data, 4 suspect medical psychological records, 5 behavioral analysis. The forensic conclusion section described the YS-TAR and autosomal DNA sequencing performed by Othram Labs, showing a 99.998% match with Maria Perez's genetic profile, independently verified by the Tennessee State Lab. The witness statement section summarized 1986 interviews, bowling alley staff, janitor, Brentwood gas station attendant, and verification of the red Pontiac later located in Arkansas. Physical evidence, including hair fibers, paint chips, and the gas receipt, was assessed as still sealed and preserved to standard, proving decisive in data recovery. Elijah's statement was recorded in a separate 10-plus page section detailing his life as Michael Thompson, vague childhood memories, and the process of discovering the truth. The consulting psychologist's report concluded he was stable, no acute trauma, but requires time to adjust to new identity. The next section, behavioral analysis, Richard Thompson, summarized the medical findings: post-traumatic depression, replacement of lost child behavior, lone actor, no violence or financial motive. The entire section was stamped closed review, no prosecution required. In the compilation section, Grace added an appendix listing every individual who had worked the case across phases from Lieutenant Harold Moore in 1986, and the original forensics team to the 2022 Project Reconnect specialists. She also wrote a short personal remark in the preface: "This file proves that no case is ever truly closed as long as someone still believes in the truth. When the 188-page report was finished, she submitted the copy to the TBI director for signature. On June 10, 2022, the office issued an internal memo officially closing the Elijah Perez case. The state database was updated to case #86-1021 SOF. A copy of the report was sent to the National Archives and the Judicial Records Repository for future research. In TBI storage, the evidence box labeled Perez #86-1021 was sealed for the last time with a gold resolved case sticker. As Grace placed the box on the shelf, she looked at the faded handwriting on the old label. The same words she had read the day she reopened the file, then gently touched it in farewell. For her and her colleagues, the Elijah Perez case was not only a professional success, but an affirmation of the value of faith, science, and human memory. In the nationwide closing statement, the TBI director wrote, "Across 3 generations of investigators, thousands of hours of work, and more than half a century of waiting, the disappearance of Elijah Perez has been officially resolved. Science did its part, but what made this miracle possible was patience and human kindness." On the very last page, just below the word solved, Grace added one brief handwritten line. "The little boy came home." After the Elijah Perez case was officially closed and the file marked solved, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation did not stop there, but immediately launched an expanded review phase under the framework of Project Reconnect. TBI leadership directed a comprehensive re-examination of all unsolved child missing person cases from 1985, 1988, to determine whether similar cases, abductions without financial motive, carried out by isolated individuals with psychological disorders, might have been overlooked in the records. Grace Holloway, who had just completed the Perez report, was again assigned as technical advisor to the new investigative team. In the first meeting after the case concluded, she explained that successfully resolving the Elijah Perez file was not only a turning point for traditional investigation, but also opened the door to establishing forensic genealogy as a standard tool in locating long-term missing persons. The statistical table she projected on the screen showed that 42 child missing person cases across Tennessee from 1985 to 1988 remained in unresolved status. Of those, at least 17 shared characteristics with the Perez case: sudden disappearance, no trace, no ransom demand, and unidentified perpetrator. TBI formed a dedicated review unit, codenamed Unit 47, consisting of DNA experts, behavioral criminologists, and psychological profilers. Their mission was to re-evaluate each case using the same process applied to the Perez file, re-examining original physical evidence, recovering biological samples, genetic genealogy matching, and verifying the viability of re-investigation. Othram Labs was again selected as the technical partner, working with the Federal Forensic Institute to support next-generation DNA sequencing. Old case boxes were brought out of cold storage, many of them dusty after 3 decades. On each box, Grace added a new label, Recheck Post-Perez Standard, marking these as cases to be processed according to the Elijah Perez template. In internal meetings, she and the technical team detailed the sequence of operations, now abbreviated as the Perez Protocol. 1. Authenticate the integrity of physical evidence. 2. Extract DNA, using ARCHID-12 technology. 3. Match YSTR and autosomal DNA data. 4. Upload results to commercial genealogical databases. And 5. Cross-reference with the National Genealogy Database. This method was regarded as the new standard for investigating cold missing person cases when old evidence was no longer sufficient for traditional perpetrator tracing. In her report to the TBI director, Grace emphasized that the Perez case proves that time is not a barrier to justice, as long as evidence is preserved and science is given a chance. Preliminary review results identified 3 additional cases from that period suitable for the same process, including the 1987 disappearance of a girl in Knoxville, a 1986 case in Chattanooga, and a 1988 case in Memphis. all retained intact biological evidence suitable for DNA testing. Under Othram's supervision, the samples were shipped out, launching an unprecedented wave of reinvestigation in Tennessee. In parallel, Grace and TBI forensic specialists collaborated with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to share data and extend the method to neighboring states such as Arkansas, Kentucky, and Alabama. Their report was presented at the 2023 National Forensic Conference, with the Elijah Perez case used as the featured case study. Grace's 74-page presentation described the entire process in detail, from locating the old case box and recovering hair samples to genealogy verification through civilian databases, and was regarded by the professional community as the standardized handbook for forensic genealogy in missing person cases. Numerous federal and state agencies subsequently requested that TBI share the Perez protocol for nationwide implementation. At TBI headquarters, a copy of the Perez file was placed on permanent display in the memorial area, next to a modern DNA sequencer and a photograph of Maria and Elijah on their reunion day. Beneath the glass, a small plaque read, "Elijah Perez Case. The proof that time does not erase truth." For younger investigators, it was not just a solved case, but a symbol of innovation in investigative thinking, where technology, patience, and humanity converge. At the end of 2023, in the annual report to the governor, the TBI director wrote, "We believe that among those dusty case boxes, there are still children like Elijah, names not yet spoken, stories not yet closed. Our duty is to keep searching for them, with all the power that science and human faith can provide." In the appendix, Grace added a short line, "From now on, every long-term missing person case in Tennessee will be reviewed under the Perez standard." That italicized sentence in the report became TBI's official commitment, that after Elijah Perez, no case would ever again be allowed to fade into darkness. 1 year after TBI released the results of its comprehensive review of missing person files, Elijah Perez, the man who had been at the center of what was considered a miracle in Tennessee investigative history, decided to launch his own project called the Perez Foundation. The idea arose from his own experience, a person who had lived his entire life under a false identity, located thanks to a single hair and DNA technology. The foundation's goals were to fund independent forensic laboratories, help families of missing persons access DNA testing, and advocate for the creation of community genetic banks to assist in identity searches. At the Foundation's launch press conference in Nashville in July 2023, Elijah stood before dozens of reporters, his hair already streaked with early gray, his voice low but resolute. He said, "If it weren't for people who believed in science and never gave up, I wouldn't be standing here." The Perez Foundation exists so that other children, no matter how many years they've been missing, will have the chance to come home. The organization quickly received support from TBI, Othram Institute of Forensic Science, numerous private foundations, and human rights groups. Grace Holloway, who had directly investigated the original case, became an honorary advisor. In its first 6 months, the foundation funded DNA testing in 5 cases in neighboring states and 2 community education programs on biological evidence preservation. During the same period, Maria Perez's health visibly declined. She suffered from chronic heart disease but continued to follow every activity of her son. On Elijah's desk, there was always the photograph of mother and son on reunion day, its silver frame engraved for every child who found the way home. In October 2023, Maria passed away peacefully in her sleep at her Nashville home at the age of 74. The funeral was simple, as she had wished. Attended only by friends, old neighbors, and the TBI investigators who had worked the case. The TBI director delivered a short eulogy. "Maria Perez taught us that faith does not reside in courtrooms, but in the hearts of those who never stop searching." Elijah stood silently, holding a picture of his young mother, his eyes shining with gratitude. At the memorial, he said, "My mother lived long enough to know the truth, and I will spend the rest of my life continuing that journey for others." After the funeral, he scattered her ashes along the banks of the Cumberland River, the area of the original 1986 search, as a symbol of complete closure. In Nashville, TBI held a final internal ceremony to complete permanent archiving of file, Perez #86-1021. In the evidence vault, Grace Holloway and the TBI director placed the original evidence box, containing the hair, the gas receipt, and Lieutenant Harold Moore's original report, into metal drawer 14B. A gold solve sticker was affixed over the old label, beneath the faded words, Elijah Perez, Missing Child, 1986. The final inventory card read, Status Solved, Closed Permanently, June 2023. Grace closed the drawer, turned the key, and stood quietly for a moment. For her, this was not just the end of one case, but the closing of a 55-year cycle that generations of investigators had poured their hearts into. In the adjacent room, the honor board listed cases solved through forensic genealogy, and the very first entry read Perez case, benchmark for genetic identification. Elijah's file became required teaching material at numerous forensic academies and is regarded as the gold standard for evidence preservation and genealogical DNA application. That winter, as Nashville lay under snow, Elijah returned to TBI headquarters one last time. He walked the hallway where he had once met his mother, paused in front of the vault, and lightly touched the metal door. "Thank you for never giving up on me," he whispered, then turned away. Outside, the gray sky shed slow flakes that blanketed the steps where search posters for the little boy had once been taped decades earlier. The Perez Foundation continued its work, expanding into other southern states and assisting in more than 10 re-identifications in its first year alone. At the Citizen Science Awards ceremony in Washington, D.C., the director of Othram Labs said, "The Perez case didn't just solve a mystery, it redefined how we connect science with humanity." That same year, TBI released a report commemorating the 55th anniversary of the disappearance, closing with a single line, Elijah Perez, found alive, 2022. Case solved, 2023. Time did not win. The final pages of the file were sealed and archived in the Central Nashville Repository, ending the longest investigation in Tennessee history, a story that began with a child taken on a rainy night in 1986 and concluded with the homecoming of a man carrying the legacy of an entire generation on his shoulders. Elijah Perez, once a symbol of loss, had become a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes justice is slow, but it always arrives. And in TBI's cold storage room, among thousands of other files, Box 14B remains, silent yet radiant, marking the end of a 55-year journey to find one child and to restore faith, that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will one day be called by name. The story of Elijah Perez, the child who vanished in 1986 and was found after 55 years, is not merely a criminal case closed by science, it is also a profound reflection of the perseverance, faith, and community values that lie at the core of American culture. In today's America, where technology advances at breakneck speed, yet people are easily swept up in the rush of modern life, this story reminds us that justice and love have no expiration date. The fact that TBI carefully preserved every piece of evidence, a single hair, a gas receipt, for more than half a century, demonstrates the system's belief in the importance of even the smallest detail, while reflecting a sense of duty and respect for the past. In a modern society where digital data and DNA technology have become powerful tools, the lesson here is that technology only truly matters when it is used to serve people, to heal, not merely to control. The image of Maria Perez, the mother who mailed letters to TBI for decades, symbolizes the power of faith, that hope is never in vain, even if the answer comes only at the end of a lifetime. And Elijah, after being found, transformed his own story into action by founding the Perez Foundation, an organization that helps other families locate loved ones through DNA. In a diverse and complex America, where tens of thousands of people still go missing each year, that act reminds us that pain can become the motivation to help others. The final lesson of the story is this: no matter how much time passes, the truth can still be found, so long as people keep believing, keep searching, and never forget one another. Thank you for joining us on the extraordinary journey of Elijah Perez, proof that justice and love always find their way home, even after half a century. Please subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying us on real stories about faith, memory, and the power of humanity against time.